We'll start the presentation. Right, so I'm going to talk about low traffic neighbourhoods, LTNs, and why are they controversial? And it's based on the data we did in introducing our first 3 LTNs. Why are they controversial? It's interesting. Before I start, it's kind of, you could say that's a rather, is that an obvious question? But actually what we want to know is, we wanted to actually find out why are they controversial. So that's what this is about. What's that? So I'm in the wrong place first. So just in a sense, this is mentioned by Rupert this morning, but basically LTNs have had a meteoric rise in policy support. They started in Waltham Forest in 2015, followed up in the tranche after the SHAPS letter and the statute guidance and tranche 1 funding. They got funded. Tranche 2 funding, more funding, which says, once again, they were one of the permissible items for funding. LTN 120, this case a local transport note, once again puts that low traffic neighbourhood streets, and as they say, encourage people to cycling, and they appear in gear change as an ambition to roll out many more low traffic neighbourhoods. And finally, there's the expression of interest that the council have been putting in for mini Holland funding, which typically does include a major element of LTNs. There is at the bottom right hand, there's a website which it hasn't been updated recently, but tracks the number of LTNs that have been implemented, and there's obviously a lot of work has gone into doing this. And at that point, there were basically 110 LTNs identified, the majority of which were in London. And then outside London, there were actually only 10 highway authorities at that point which had LTNs. And 6 of them are big cities like Bournemouth and Greater Manchester, and 3 were in university towns. And if you're considering there actually are 115 highway authorities out of outside London, it's an interesting question as, are they really too controversial for local authorities to take on? Or are they gradually going to spread across the country? So that's kind of the background. This has been said. I can keep doing it wrong. Whoops. Sorry, was it? Yes, right place. So in terms of the cost, kind of the LTN report card, I would say they're cost effective, they're transformative. If you dig beneath the surface noise, they're popular, but they certainly are controversial. These are the part of the LTNs we put in Oxford, and basically we worked out of the 14 filters you put in, it's around about £4,000 at each location. And in terms of a benefit cost ratio, it has an amazingly high benefit cost ratio we calculated. Transformative, it's difficult to take photos to show this, but that road we're looking at used to have something like 4,000 or 5,000 cars going along it, something like that. And then the bottom hand shows it was a fairly busy road, not very pleasant. People were asking for a zebra at this point, and the top image shows what it is mostly like now. I mean, we haven't actually done a survey, but it's probably a few hundred cars going along that road now, and it really, in terms of cycling, it has transformed the feel of what it feels like. This is a survey from London, which a representative survey, so that actually it should represent accurately what people say. And as you can see from the left-hand column, that different groups, by political party, by age, and by gender at the bottom, all of them, there were kind of nearly 20% of strong support and some almost 50% support. But equally, on the other side, you see the fact that in every case, there was almost between 10 and 20% of people who strongly oppose. And so in a sense, that leads on to the next slide, that they are controversial. And here in Oxford, we are getting a taste of that. On the left-hand side, you see one of the planters, lovingly tended by the local residents. We had an arrangement with the local residents to do it. On the right-hand side, we have an attempt by somebody to actually poured petrol over the filter, so over the planter, and tried to burn it. They weren't 100% successful, but they certainly made their mark. So it's a bit like Marmite of the transport, love them or hate them, really. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the data we got from doing the Cowley LTNs, which are the ones in the red square. And just so you understand the context, Cowley is, there are 3 areas, Temple Cowley, Florence Park and Church Cowley within that area, about 6,000 houses. Most of the houses were actually built, perhaps ironically, for the car industry, which was centred in Cowley. They are in some kind of survey counted as multicultural metropolitans. About 34% houses, a third are car free, and about a third are of ethnic minority, which around half of those are Asian. Anyway, so to get on to the data, if you want to find out more detailed, it is sitting on our consultation website, but it's hard to find unless you use this this web link. Anyway, who supports LTNs and who doesn't? Basically found 5 factors impact on LTN support. And I'm going to have lots of nice charts because I like I'm an evidence-based person, so I like to explain it. But anyway, we found it was basically there was differences between the local LTN areas, the different areas. The streets where residents live were a major factor in those. The more rat run, the more they were supportive, mostly. We asked residents their priorities for their streets, and that actually, people actually voted with what they wanted for their streets. The mode of travel was a major factor, and then 2 of these personal characteristics, gender, age, ethnicity, and disability, were also influential, and I will say that when I get to them. So lots of charts coming up because I like evidence, and generally what we've got is on the green on the left-hand side where it's a tick, that's people, the number of respondents who supported the LTN, and then the amber or kind of yellowy colour on the other side, orange colour, is the number who didn't. So over the whole of Cowley areas, 61% were full support, the light green is partial support, and 27% didn't support the LTNs. But kind of that was, so basically you got 70% support, 30% lack of opposition. But we'll see how the different groups. So first of all, there was different levels of support by those 3 different areas within it. We can't from the survey say why that is. Danny will probably have his own comments. So perhaps I'll leave that to him to say, but there was definitely different support. I would say one of the ways to say it is that Florence Park had a lot more work done on it over many years, whereas Church Cowley, they kind of more or less woke up within about 6 months from the idea to actually getting it. So that might be one of the reasons why it's differential support. This is the support from individual roads on the left-hand side, and the ones with a square box around them were roads with particularly high levels of rat running, and generally the respondents in living in a high level of rat running were very supportive. Up to 95% of all respondents in Mimers Lane supported the LTN. Whereas the bottom one, which is Mayfair Road area, shows that in areas where there are perhaps not so many benefits, support becomes a little bit 50-50. We asked in the survey, we asked residents what their priorities for their street or area was. In fact, we asked the question before we talked about whether they supported the LTN. And this chart just shows the kind of percentage of the total 100% in terms of potential support. And the highest support were definitely for the measures that were actually going to be improved by the LTN, reducing speeds, traffic speeds, air pollution, making cycling safer, making it easier for children to play, reduce and remove traffic, make it easier to cross roads on foot. The bottom line, which had the least support, was the one which basically contradict the LTN, which was keep local roads open so car trips are easy and convenient. But we'll look at that one, that final one first, in terms of the people who supported the LTN, what they said, and the people who didn't support the LTN. So the top bar is what the people who didn't support the LTN said about the priority keeping local roads open so car trips are easy and convenient. And as you can see from that, they said that is 67%, or in fact 70% if you count important, said that was very important. So that was their priority. Whereas the people who supported the LTN gave it a very low priority. Just 7% said it was very important, and almost 50% said there was actual no benefit. So that's an important thing, I think, that people are voting kind of what they actually believe. And if you look at, we could put all the main factors here. So first we look at the people who supported the LTN, and they were all very much, 80% said it's important, very important to make cycling safer. It's 77% said it's very important to reduce speed. So all those green ones, they wanted all those factors of making cycling safer, reduce speed, stop back running, children priority, were all important, and as we already seen, keeping roads open wasn't important. So what did the people who didn't support the LTN say? They gave all those priorities a very, very few of them said they were very important, and compared with the priority in their views, they're keeping roads open so that car traffic is convenient. I think it's important that we know that, so we've actually got a kind of a different a cultural shift or cultural clash here between what's important for your local area. The next factor is transport kind of modes. Because it was in COVID-19 and people's normal behavior was already very upset, we asked the question, what's your normal way of travel? So to kind of get what probably they did before COVID-19 stuck. And they could answer my normal way of travel. They could tick more than one box. So we're looking at the ones, basically I'll look at what the people who said their normal way of travel was walking, cycling, car driver, and bus. And as you can see, not many said the normal way by bus, but we'll look at what they said as well. So that's going on to. So here again, these are the responses from the respondents of who were firstly normal cyclists. Normal cyclists were all very much in favour of the LTNs. Normal people normally walked were also very much in favour. Normal bus, there was a little bit of opposition, but still in favour. Normal drivers, people ticked the normal driver thing, the normal driver question. That was really kind of 50-50. Basically 46% were opposing it. And go on. So we just look at those normal drivers and understand kind of drill into that data a little bit more. So this is just and what we found was that the people who said they normally drive, we could also look at what do they say about in terms of cycling. And what we found is if they also ticked normally cycle, which is the bottom bar, I said cycle more, which should say normal cycle, they were basically in support of the LTN. They cycled sometimes, they were still generally in support, and if they didn't cycle, they were basically there was a much stronger opposition. And I think that partly shows, and I think Roger said this earlier, that if you've got another, if you've got an alternative mode, it isn't so painful. Let's say the restrictions on car use. And just to kind of follow on that, we also asked people, when the LTN is, will you cycle more during the LTN trial? And you can see from this that people already cycling were very willing to cycle more. The people who cycle sometimes were relatively willing to cycle more, but the people who don't currently cycle were least likely to want to cycle. Most of them said they wouldn't cycle more. And finally, we'll go on to the 5 personal connected characteristics: gender, age, ethnicity, and disability. First of all, gender, we actually found no difference. LTN support was basically the same across male respondents and female respondents. And we also got kind of, as you can see at the top, a relatively very similar response rate from the two genders. So gender did not seem to be an issue in terms of LTN support. Age, perhaps surprisingly, was also not much of an issue as well. Slightly less support for over 65-year-olds than the under 34 years, but if you look at the do not support, it's actually similar. So really fairly marginal in terms of age. But ethnicity, there we have quite a distinct difference. The white respondents were, over 70% in support, whereas for the Black, Asian and minority ethnic, it was only around about 50% support, with about 40% not supporting it. We then drilled into that data, which is the next chart, and we looked in terms of whether the respondents were also normal car drivers. And I think what came out that the Asian respondents were a higher percentage of the Asian respondents were normal car drivers, and that that higher percentage of normal car drivers were also more likely to oppose the LTN. And that factor alone was actually explained most of that difference between the previous chart. So there's a kind of a higher strength of feeling or high use of car among the respondents from the Asian respondents. And finally, and probably one of the most difficult areas, is disability. And once again, with disability, we found higher levels of lack of support among people with any disability. That's the top bar. Still just about a majority supporting it compared with the bottom bar, those people with no disability. And once again, we looked into that data. And first we looked into, sorry, just get my manager. Yes, first we looked into the individual disabilities, and we found that, in a sense, any disability there's still less support than for people with no disability, but in particular, in the bottom bar, that those with mobility issues were most definitely not in favour, did not support the LTN. So we've got 72 opposing at the bottom. And then we looked into that chart again, once in terms of car ownership, whether they ticked as a normal car driver. And it's true that once again, for those with mobility issues, are more reliant on the car, and those ones more reliant on the car were opposition. But it should also point out that with disability, there's quite a lot of support from those people who were not normal car drive. So a lot of opposition from those who are not normal car drivers. So it isn't only a factor of car use for those with disabilities. So finally, my final slide, what were lessons learned? I would say I've got my 5 Ps for what you have to do if you're going to go forward with an LTN. First of all, you've got to have it in your policy. It's a national policy, but you need a local policy. We'd already put LTN support in our Oxford LC whip. Second, you have to choose your place carefully. And one of the things of choosing the place carefully is have the next one, having your local councillor or local councillors in support. That's key. But also you need to have your chief transport planner, whatever, head of the environment or whatever the term is, in support. And you also need your cabinet member for transport. And luckily for that, Cowley, we had all 3 squarely behind putting the LTN in. Then obviously you need the funding. And finally, you need the programme, by which I mean, once it's in the programme, it there's a momentum for it to happen. When that goes on to the resources, staff, it is very intensive. I mean, I've probably answered 200-300 emails. I've probably fielded an enormous number of phone calls, and there's other people who've been doing this as well. So it's very intensive. And in terms of communications, you need to talk to emergency services. We had quite some difficulties in this first LTN, kind of getting emergency services aware that this has affected them. with our second LTNs, we're not having, it was the opposite problem, you could say. Talking to the public is obviously another, we did it via 2 lots of leaflet drops. Schools, they were several of our schools were very opposed to it, and 1 or 2 of our schools were in favour. Businesses generally opposite, generally, I think by experience, are always opposing LTNs. And that comes on to you have to justify, you have to be sure why you're doing it. You have to, because it upsets lots of people. So you need to say why, you have to have good reasons. And they come down, at least for Oxford, it was urban livability, and that these LTNs were basically promoting several very important cycle routes, active travel. And that comes back to which where Danny, I hope, could say something, is that we were very much reliant in some ways on local campaign groups to spread the news, to kind of win over hearts and minds. So anyway, thank you, everyone. I will just the final word, they are worth it, but do not underestimate the challenge of getting them in. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I talk now, or do you want Q&A, or shall I talk? I'm mostly following up on what Patrick said, I think. So
I think if you do a bit now, Danny, and then we'll have a Q&A on this half.
Okay, so one of the reasons for the difference between the 3 LTNs is simply demographics. So if I share this map, sorry, my tab's in random order or something like that. Here we go. So this map shows the 3 LTNs. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's Florence Park, there's Temple Cowley, and there's Church Cowley here. In general, there's a strong demographic gradient from northwest to southeast. So southeast is where the factories were, that's poorer. Northeast is where the university is, that's richer. But car ownership, at least in East Oxford, is inversely correlated with that. So the areas further out have higher levels of car ownership. So Florence Park had lower rates of car ownership and higher cycling rates, probably simply because it's closer to the city centre, and so it's easier for people to cycle. So I think that probably explains almost all the difference in the initial support. Florence Park also had more initial work done. So that is Oxfordshire Liveable Streets, crowdfunded a full plan for an LTN. We got a highways engineer from Waltham Forest, I think it was about £2,500, £3,000 to draw up a full sort of like plan with costings for an LTN. I think the costings came up to somewhere between, I think it was like a bare bones was £130,000, £150,000, and the full thing was going to be £500,000, which is about 10 times as much as was actually spent on Florence Park in the end. So we didn't get any of the nice things that they got in Waltham Forest. We don't have continuous crossings on the entries. We've got no extra traffic calming inside the LTN, just the bare modal filters. So anyway, that's the background to that. But yes, a fair bit of community work was done, more of it in Florence Park than elsewhere. And I think that helped a lot. I think otherwise springing these things on people without warning is a real problem. The more people have a chance to adjust to the idea and sort of understand what the rationale for it is, the better. I was going to talk a bit about community activation, which is not actually my thing. Somebody else was supposed to talk here. But one of the things that was done was Active Oxfordshire commissioned maps. So if you Google Liveable Cowley maps, you'll get the 2 maps that were made by this. One is a general map showing walking routes and encouraging people to find local destinations, so local businesses, local parks, etc. And the other one is specifically for children. It's a choose your own adventure map that was distributed to all primary school children for free. So there've also been some cycling training and maintenance workshops and stuff like that, but I think that's not actually attached to this LTN. That's just part of activities that would have happened anyway. I actually think there's a huge gaping need for a bike shop somewhere in Cowley, because the Halfords that used to be here, and it's actually seen on the map there, that's shut down. So there's actually no bike shop anywhere within these 3 LTNs. There are several to the north up here, but nothing in here at all as far as I know. And that, I think, is a major, well, it's a business opportunity and a lack from a community perspective. there were several school street schemes put in to accompany these LTNs. So the two that are relevant here is one in St Christopher's here and one in Larkrise here. There it is. But those have had, limited support from schools, in the sense that I think schools have sort of been totally overloaded in the last year. So, and Larkrise, at least, where my daughter goes, there's nobody in the school has any resources to put into this. So it largely fell to Sustrans, which was the body commissioned to sort of set them up and run them, and parent and community volunteers. But that's operated kind of separately from the LTN process. It hasn't really directly involved the county so much. There were a few screw-ups in the process. I don't know, Patrick didn't mention those, but in Church Cowley, the modal filters went in a week before the letters notifying residents that they were happening arrived. So you can imagine how that went down with people who suddenly found they couldn't drive home on their way back from work or something like that. Similarly, the school, the ETROs, some of the school street schemes weren't really planned properly. They didn't consult with the school heads before they went out, and so they had the wrong starting times for the schools and things like that. So I think the county's been severely under-resourced, so a lot of it has fallen to community groups to sort of fill in the gaps. The whole area was lifted several times, both by pro and anti groups, about the LTNs. But that's, I don't think it should really fall to, well, the county needs to do more in the way of providing information about what's happening and what the motivation for the schemes are. It really hasn't been much community engagement. I mean, again, because they've been under-resourced. I mean, we don't have the funds that Waltham Forest had, which was like 10% of a £40 million budget or something like that, just for community engagement and consultation. So that's basically all I wanted to say. But if anyone's got any questions about community involvement in this, feel free to ask them in the chat or request Q&A.
That's good. Thanks, Danny. So there was one question. So the first question you answered in the Q&A, which was this a poll or a self-selecting survey? And it was this, Patrick, was from a consultation essentially. So it's a self-selecting response.
I mean, we sent out a leaflet to everyone saying that to go onto the website to fill in the form, saying that we've introduced this, please go on and put your comments in. But yes, so obviously it's self-selected, and so
this is also the pre-implementation consultation.
This is the pre-implementation.
So are you able to release?
And it's the pre-implementation of the first one, so
yes,
it's fair to say the LTNs hadn't quite reached the level of controversy that they had for the pre-implementation of the second batch that we've just gone through. The next question was about the channels used to get the message out, and that I think there was a combination of community and local authority channels. So Danny's talked a bit about some of the community groups that were active. I know that some of the local councillors were out there knocking on doors and telling people about it. One of the community groups set up a pop-up shop in Oxford, and plans and visualisations for the LTN were part of that. We did that as part of the Coalition for Healthy Streets and Active Travel when we were able to get a kind of a free lease for an empty shop for a while. Any other thoughts and ideas?
Well, I mean, there were frequent meetings organised, in fact, also by Oxfordshire Liveable Streets with the councillors and, mostly myself as the officer, which went over several months. So where councillors at least were, and that's, I think, an important element, that councillors were kind of, questions were answered, and they kind of, and I say local councillor support, I think, is actually a key element to this success of these LTNs. The councillors themselves did council newsletters talking about them, so that was another way that people got to know them. And then we did have it on the website as well. Once we'd put out this the letter drop. I say had all the plans and maps on the website, but it really, I mean, this is where I think Oxfordshire Liveable Street certainly did a lot of the work beforehand to raise the awareness of this. And without, it would have been much harder, let's say, without the campaign group.
Yeah, and also I think Oxfordshire Liveable Streets, or maybe it's Liveable Cowley, Denny, have is it a monthly drop-in, essentially web conference, or did do throughout part of the time?
We were running a number of things. So our own meetings were kind of open to anyone who was interested to turn up. We were also running sort of at one point weekly LTN meetings when the peak of the excitement about the active travel funding. I don't think they're actually running. We're not running weekly anymore. I think they've dropped back to monthly. But notionally, just anyone in the city to discuss low traffic neighbourhoods.
And it's probably worth mentioning that the work doesn't stop after it goes in. The local councillor is holding, I think, web meetings with residents every few weeks, or has been doing so, to answer queries and questions and complaints. So it is very resource intensive, basically, putting an LTN.
There's another good question here. Are there specific measures or objectives, this is probably best for you, Patrick, for the success of an LTN?
The funding was justified by the fact that actually there's a very key cycle route, which has always been a cycle route, which goes all the way into the deprived wards, which are further out, of Mintry Farm and Blackbird Leys, which are among the 10% most deprived wards in the UK. And there's this kind of a route, which is what I showed that image of, which is basically a residential road. It's not got any status in terms of an A road or B road, and it kind of goes almost all the way into the centre. So the purpose of the kind of main purpose, as far as the DfT funding, was to actually improve that that road, which is a cycle route, all the way into the centre. And the Cowley was the first part. The second one, the East Oxford one, will actually complete the second half of that route, although actually the second half of the cycle route is not quite so bad, because it's already more residential streets. Then we also have the sense we're responding to lots. There were, over the years, many complaints about traffic on that road, and there were also kind of costs, like the part I showed you. People were asking for a zebra to get to the co-op, which was on the kind of in the middle, but no, there'd be absolutely no need to put the costs of putting a zebra or a toucan or pelican into it, because the street is now quiet. So there were kind of those cost benefits from the LTN, kind of not having to treat that road like a main road, but actually treating it like it's a residential road, which it is, which it should be.
We'll have to move on. A couple of quick answers needed. Are there plans to get funding for complementary measures, for instance, SUDS, street trees, cycle hangers?
Well, we have put in an EOI to do a mini Holland over. So basically, because having said that,
I'll stop you there, Patrick, because there's quite a few questions and we need to swap over. Right. And there's one about, would you say the decision-making process came down to a referendum, or was it a bit more nuanced than that?
No, I don't think it was a referendum. I mean, we put in the reasons why the LTN was good. It's worth putting this. We'd also we had taken the councillors, or the council had taken the councillors to visit Waltham Forest, and we were kind of convinced by the benefits, and so was the cabinet member. She'd visited, and she was also convinced. I think it was easy in the fact that actually the local area came out as in majority support. If it had come out in minority support, I suspect it would have still gone ahead, as long as it was a kind of not too much of a minority, but we didn't face that issue about, you know, the local people don't want it. Do we still go ahead? Thankfully.
Okay, well, let's switch over topics, and hopefully we'll have time. We may have time to come back to some of those other questions at the end. So I'm going to talk to you now about a different topic, and hopefully that will come up on your screens. Yes, that looks good. And Patrick, you put your thumb, or Daniel, can you put your thumbs up if you've got that visible now?
Yeah, it's fine. That's it.
Good. So this is the Abingdon Cycling and Walking Network Plan, which I describe as a community developed LC WIP. And as I say, I'm the chair of the Oxfordshire Cycling Network, but I live in Abingdon, and
Robin, you've gone quiet.
that better?
Yes, yeah, we're back in.
Not having much to do over the first lockdown. I kind of got together with other people in Abingdon, and this is what we did. So I'm going to talk to you about why, how and what, but just in case you're not familiar with Abingdon, it's a market town of about 35,000 people just south of Oxford. And so why did we do this? Well, as campaigners or advocates, it's something consistent to ask for. And as I think of it as really a prototype LC WIP, it's something that the county council can, that's Patrick, for example, can ask for funding from government. And it also helps district and town councils with their responses to developers, housing developers, for example. Also, Abingdon was just starting to develop its neighbourhood plan, so it could be built into that. And the county is just starting to develop its a series of LC WIPs, essentially working town by town. And we hope that this will put us higher up the list for those. But it has limited resources to do those, so we thought that this would help to accelerate the process. How do we do it? Essentially, I'm going to talk you through this process, but I'm happy to share these slides. I think that Landor will share all the slides, and if not, you can always contact me on Twitter, or my email addresses at the end of the presentation here for you to jot down. So first of all, we formed a team. We'd set up a small Abingdon cycling campaign group called Abbey Bike, but we reached out to the much larger main cycling group in Abingdon called Freewheeling. The sustainability group in Abingdon is quite large, and there's also a health walks group, and quite a few people from the town council are very much involved in cycling and walking and sustainability. It's got quite a that kind of feel about it in the town, and overall we have 40 people contribute to the project. We called our group Abingdon Liveable Streets, inspired by Oxfordshire Liveable Streets, of which Danny is a part. And then the first practical job was to start by identifying a network of routes. I started building this myself after volunteering to do medicine deliveries during the first lockdown. I think many towns had a similar scheme, but one of the local cyclists set up a network with a few of the pharmacies here. I volunteered for that and started discovering all these little cut-throughs through the town, and then eventually sat down one day, printed out a big map of the town, and started drawing up a network aiming to get to a grid of about 300 to 400 meters grid density, and then reviewed that with a couple of the, I hope they won't mind me calling them old timers, but people who had lived in the town for a few decades and cycled around it and knew all of the back routes, and they found me a few that I hadn't spotted. And there's a few really hidden gems in the town where you can cycle through more or less legally, or possibly could be made legal. And we even found a few more as we did the surveying, which I'll come on to in a minute later. But we ended up with 12 radial routes, which are the blue ones, which came nicely round a clock face, more or less. 11 connectors, which are the orange routes, and then 2 rings. There's a small central ring and then an outer ring, which unfortunately isn't complete because of the River Thames. Although which means you can't do a full circulation plan Dutch style or Ghent style, but I'm not recommending that we build a brand new set of bridges across the Thames to complete it. Then developed a guidebook and template. So the templates on the left, well, covers most of the slide here, essentially 4 columns just in Microsoft Word or a Google Docs version for the people who don't have Word, because we can get quite a lot of people involved in this, and they don't all have Office on their computers. Essentially, so they could put in a description of the route section by section, paste in pictures, describe what it was like, put in their thoughts about what it would look like in the future, and maybe some quick fixes, which might be just signage or filling in potholes or such like. And this was before LTN 120 came out, which unfortunately means we didn't have a single standard set of standards. So I developed a 8-page document to help people through it, which drew from the Cycle Nation guide. We have in Oxfordshire a set of cycling and walking standards that I could draw from. The London Cycling Design Standards, of course, many of you will know, and the Wheels for Wellbeing Guide to Inclusive Cycling, which is co-authored by an Oxfordshire local as well. And we assigned the routes to people and set them off, and of course they came back with some horrors, such as your classic on the bottom left there, too narrow cycle lane. That's really one that's more dangerous than not having a cycle lane. On the top right, kind of the takeaway where the cars park on a double yellow line, bus stop and cycle lane simultaneously. Actually, sometimes they're parking on the pavement as well, which makes a quadruple offence. And the Marketplace Junction, which is a real problem site. I'm not going to go into detail. I could make a whole presentation out of that. But then there are also some delights. My personal favourite is the Daisy Bank Path here, which is a mile long and goes between, it must be thousands of houses, all the way through kind of houses to the north, houses to the south, not crossing a road until you get virtually to the centre of town, where there's a Toucan crossing, and then you're into Waitrose car park, and right in the middle of the town centre. And so that's a really valuable active travel asset, shared most of the time harmoniously between walkers and cyclists. Unfortunately, it's too narrow. Wouldn't pass LTN 120, but it's still a very valuable asset. LTNs I haven't mentioned yet. Well, it turns out that we have them already. The Cycle Streets tool that's come up in a couple of sessions today already wasn't available at the time, but we sat down more recently and looked at it, used that to assess Abingdon. And most of Abingdon is already traffic calmed or not through road, and the few rat runs that the tool pulls out don't in practice turn out to be rat runs, because the main roads don't clog up in the right places to force traffic down them. So we don't have a big new opportunity for rat runs for Patrick to come and stir up fresh controversies down, much to his delight, I'm sure. So following all those surveys, some people, of course, managed to get about 30 volunteers, assigned the 25 routes to them. Some people in single people or pairs of people. Some people delivered excellent surveys in a week or so and were up for more. Some decided they couldn't do it, so I reassigned the route to somebody else. Some responded with gaps or low quality responses. And of course, it's quite difficult to ask volunteers to redo things or do them better. That was a process of about 6 weeks for the surveying. But it was locked down. The weather was sunny, I'm sure you remember. And my work was, I'm a business consultant normally, so my work was very quiet. And I had plenty of time to go out and take some pictures, measure things that weren't measured, fill in the gaps. Took my secateurs out and trimmed some hedges while I was at it. Then kind of edited the surveys to a reasonable level of quality and consistency. Some of those just took an hour because they were already pretty good, or the route was simple, and some took a day, and I think one or two took a bit more than that. And overall, that process took probably 2.5 months putting those together, and we ended up with about 400 pages across the 25 routes. Surveys of what they are now, with pictures and proposals for quick fixes and a long-term future, each route with a kind of 1 or 2 pages of maps with numbers showing where particular features were on them. And then there was a job of writing a summary. So I sat down and wrote a 35-page summary report, again, kind of checking it off with we had a core team of people that I would check these things off. And that contained a kind of context for the town and for active travel overall. The approach we took, the plan for the network, and crucially the prioritization, and of course acknowledgements for all the wonderful people who'd helped on the process. And we sent this off to councillors and key authors in the county council, the district council and the town council. The prioritization is really the key to the summary, because what we're aiming to do there is to say that, knowing how funding tends to come, I won't say quite at random, but it tends to come in fits and starts due to the processes we live under. Abingdon might get a couple of £100,000 worth of funding, or it might suddenly get £1 million or even £5 million worth of funding from some scheme. I mean, what if we were chosen to be Mini Holland? So I wanted to get different levels of scheme that you might do with different types of funding. So we've thought about prioritization based on where people want to travel, where needs improving, and how easy or difficult, in other words, how expensive it would be to improve them, and developed a phased approach from the current situation. A next step, which was thinking about the immediate safety problems, where in particular, we found high levels of casualties on crash map, and where we knew kind of the big problems were, and then picked out 5 low-cost priority routes which we thought could be improved at reasonably low costs, because, for example, there were main roads with very wide verges or good service roads alongside them that could be converted, and then turning that into a coherent network that covered the whole town, but not too expensively, and then finally the full plan, which would be expensive to deliver. And what's happened since? Well, there are 2 improvements that happened or were set in place while we were really working on the plan. So we can't claim credit, but we're glad that they've happened. There are 2 that have happened really as a result, I think, of our work. Sustrans has got some funding for a design study of the Marketplace Junction, which is one of our most dangerous spots. And there's a design study of Ox Street, which is one of the most difficult streets in Abingdon, included in the Tranche 3 bid. And the County Council is now working on a kind of an official LC whip. I'll come on to the difference between what we've done and an official LC whip in a second. And Abingdon, the neighbourhood plan actually got held up by COVID. We carried on with ours, but the neighbourhood plan Abingdon decided to put on hold. So I'm now on the Abingdon neighbourhood plan steering group, making sure this is incorporated with that. And 2 lessons learned, I think I'll include from this. One is that there is a huge benefit of local route knowledge, and talking to people who've been around town and just going around it a lot myself. But the limits we have as volunteers, we're not highways engineers, and so we have limits. And I was most conscious of those in not knowing about costings. I have a kind of vague idea about some things. I've tuned into many episodes of Ideas with Beers and other webinars and so forth, so I pick things up, but I don't know costings. I don't know about the details of turning arcs and visibility displays. That's where my knowledge kind of runs out. And so the best results you probably get are from joint efforts between council or local authority engineers and community. Get the best of both worlds. And then the second one, it does, just as Patrick said, it takes time to organize and quality control these things. And so you need a keen project leader, and you need somebody to act as quality controller. In Abingdon, I kind of volunteered myself to be both of these, and kind of kept this moving along, kind of because I kind of enjoy doing these things. And I feel a certain pride in the finished result. That's where I get my buzz from, and hopefully it does some. I will feel even more pride when one of those junctions gets improved, and we've got a better place to cycle, and we see more people cycling because of it, and indeed crossing the road, because that one actually is probably more about pedestrian crossings than cycling. Thank you very much. We're probably all on for questions now.
Comments. What have we got?
Someone's asking whether your stay was mostly cycling focused. So how much attention did you pay to walking?
Yes, so it's a good question. So people very often ask that when they look at the map, because the map shows long routes which are essentially cycling focused routes. Most of the walking interventions are focused on specific places where walking is difficult, or indeed it's difficult for people with mobility issues to cross the road, or there are particular actually walking casualties that we found on Crash Map, and we got particular input from the Health Walks people. So I think we so when you look at the map, it looks cycling route focused, but we do highlight particular walking issues in particular places. So I think it's a reason. I think it's a reasonable balance between the two.
Yeah, I just want to add on that we've always tried quite hard in what I try personally in communications to pretty much never talk about cycling in isolation, and just talk about walking and cycling. In Oxford, it's not quite as bad as it is in other places because cycling rates are quite high. So there hasn't been a concerted attempt to make it a kind of anti-cycling campaign by people opposed to the low traffic neighbourhoods. I think they realise that would in fact backfire quite badly. A very different situation to somewhere, say, like, I don't know, Abingdon. What's the cycling rates in Abingdon? It's significantly lower than Oxford, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, there's no data available, unfortunately, for Abingdon.
From 2011, but in any event, even more so than in Oxford, you'd want to avoid, pitching it as a cycling initiative.
Yes. And we do get to. I mean, there are. We do, of course, have incidents where there are some places where walkers and cyclists are in conflict, and you get a few people who cycle irresponsibly, just as you get a few people who are irresponsible walkers, pedestrians, and irresponsible car drivers. That doesn't mean you shouldn't provide facilities for any of the people in any of the transport modes. But yeah, the answer is any of the problems we spotted either for walking or cycling, we adopted the same process for seeking out the problems and the same approach for including the fixes for them in the plan. So we tried to keep it balanced in that way. And within the inner ring, the crossings are just, there's two particular crossings that are problems for both of them. And we're and there's also some narrow pavement issues that we particularly identified for walking. And we were doing this at in the middle of lockdown, so the width of pavement issue was particularly highlighted, so we were very conscious of that.
In terms of, I think I'll just say from a council's perspective, it's enormously helpful, because I must be one of the people who produced most I've actually produced 3 LC whips in my time, but they are the kind of the auditing of the routes and the finding of the routes. I noticed is one of the most time-consuming elements of producing an LC whip. Though it does kind of create an interesting, I'm not sure what, a dilemma or something, how you go from a community-led one, right, you're done, Robin, to becoming the adopted council LC whip. And it's, let's say we're still kind of slightly trying to find our way. What are the quality control bits that go from one to the other? And how much do we need to recheck, or how much do we make sure everything says? I know in your case, Robin, they're probably going to be all excellent.
Well, there's one bit I've proposed a cycling contraflow, and I've basically got no idea whether the co-op delivery truck can get round the corner in what I've proposed. So I need somebody professional to come and have a look at it.
Yes, we are intending to introduce adopt the LC whip, and but it's staff resources as ever. As always our council's problems. Yeah,
but if we've got you kind of, if we've done the kind of 3/4 of the effort, and it needs there's a few little bits that need ironing out, we can have a useful discussion about it. That's why I think the kind of joint approach is there's a lot of value in that. It's getting the like we found with some other things, if you start cooperating on something early and you get a little bit of joint working early in a project, you can flag up some of the issues with local knowledge. I think that's got a huge benefit.
So in Oxford, they're trialling sort of what's called co-production, I think, in the rebuild of some of the arterial routes, I think on the Woodstock Road, trying to bring cycling groups in particular and pedestrians association in at an early stage. So instead of just being given sort of detailed plans on which they get to tweak a few minor points or complain about a few things, they actually get brought into the the sort of planning stages for these routes. So hopefully that will result in better quality cycling stuff, because even as of last year, the county is still building sort of seriously horrible cycling infrastructure, and something's going wrong in the process between the goals of the county, of the council, and what actually ends up being put in concrete on the ground.
Perhaps on a more positive note, as I think it's time, isn't it? I think the what I'd say, working with the council and campaign groups, council officers and campaign groups working together is a very beneficial. Not always as straightforward, but way forward.
Yeah.
Are we 1:40? We're actually time to finish, unless there's any other.
We are. I think we are on time, but I think it's a good point to end it to. And sometimes, I think it's fair to say sometimes we are kind of arguing with each other, and sometimes we're kind of agreeing with each other almost, and sometimes we're arguing with each other knowing we're agreeing with each other on another level. It's an interesting relationship, but we've all got the same objectives here. That's the important thing.
Right.
Yes. The problem is not so much, I mean, because Patrick is an active travel officer as such, so he tends to agree with us. The problem is more some of the other highways officers, I think, who are coming from a rather different perspective and don't necessarily think about active travel at all when they're planning things.
Anyway, so shall we say thank you everyone, and
yes, thank you for listening. I hope that was useful, and if there's anything else, I'm certainly from my perspective, I'm happy to follow up questions if you reach out to me afterwards.
And equally so, patrick.lingwood@oxfordshire.gov.uk. So thank you everyone. I say
I'm looking forward to the grand finale.
Right.
Political bravery.
Right. Bye everyone, and thank you.